We are going into the final session, which is the round table. And before we, start introducing ourselves and start talking about it, we again start with Professor Elaine Ashton. So we just take off from where she left off, the final presentation, where she said, we have to traverse the road, no matter how hard it is, no matter how hopeless it seems at the end of the road, but there's hope, because if we walk the road, we will reach there. So I think the last final part of her presentation will take off from there, and after that we take off from there and we continue with the roundtable. Elaine.
Okay, I'm not trying to be hierarchical by standing up here. I just don't want to have the pain of reorganizing the technology, the laptop. We have enough of that. Okay, so this short contribution to the table, the political is personal, anti-adaptive healing and burnout. Okay, so picture this. A man sits alone mourning the death of his beloved. So deep is his grief that he tries to conjure the spirit of his lost loved one. A ghost appears, but it's not the spirit of his beloved. Rather, this is the ghost of a lost future, and this is some of what she says. I'm the ghost of a dead future. I'm the ghost of a future that never happened. I'm dead. I'm lucky to be a ghost. Make me happen, please, please. Don't let me go. I'm the best. I'm a brilliant future, and I could easily have happened. But stupid kept choosing the wrong things and let me die. I'm a future you'd really like. Everyone would have liked me if I'd happened. Because you're what? Asked the man. Equality and cake and no bad bits at all. And I've been glimpsed, I've been died for in China and Russia and South America, and here in your little country's history. Long ago people wanted me. They wanted me over and over, and 40, 50 years ago, I had friends. I really, nearly, but my enemies say I'm utopia, a nowhere place. What I've just described is one of several ghostly encounters as staged in Carol Churchill's elliptical short play, What If Only, at the Royal Court Theatre, London in 2021. Now in 21, echoes of the pandemic were resonant in this piece. The loss of loved ones the world over, the millions who died. But coming at this advanced stage of Churchill's career that now spans over 60 years, I feel that What If Only is also infused with a retrospective feeling, a spirited lamentation for an alternative, socially progressive, feminist future that has haunted Churchillian landscapes past and present, as we looked at yesterday. Time and time again, Churchill's returned to the notion of socially and ecologically sustainable futures damaged or destroyed by systems of capitalist and patriarchal power. All those what if only lost possibilities of alternative futures that haunt her theatre. So I've been looking at the what if only dimensions of Churchill's theatre as I retrace the evolution of her eco-socialist feminism. And from that work that I've been doing, there are two interconnecting ideas that I wanted to bring to the round table. The first is a proposal to consider the political is personal, which is a reversal of second wave feminism's mantra, the personal is political. The second is the notion of anti-adaptive healing, which has been coined by Hannah Proctor in her illuminating monograph, Burnout, the Emotional Experience of Political Defeat. And both relate to the issue of political burnout, the question of how to keep on keeping on with political struggles when over the years, over decades, as Churchill's Ghost of the Lost Alternative Future puts it, stupid, kept choosing the wrong things and let me die. So first then, the first idea, the political is personal, allied to the issue of burnout. So when the political values of the feminist theatre maker keep repeatedly moving further and further away over time, what do you do? And this is a question I feel Churchill has addressed through what I propose as a reverse formulation. The political is personal. And by this, I mean her attention to the negative emotional impact that an anti-democratic regime has on people's everyday personal lives, and how this might be rendered to elicit a critical sensing that an alternative is desirable and still possible. So when I tried researching for anyone else thinking about the political is personal, I came across an interesting article on the costs of daily politics by Brett Q. Ford et al., the reference is here, who observed that although, quote, day-to-day political events and controversies often occur far away and revolve around issues that can seem irrelevant to most people's daily lives, such distant events can have very personal consequences for the average person. Drawing on political psychology and affective science, they set out to empirically test and prove their theory that daily politics do have an emotional impact on people's lives, politics of all stripes, left or right. So I've been encouraged by that to think along similar lines, but more specifically tracing how the cost of neoliberal daily politics have come increasingly to the fore in Churchill's theatre over the time when she could see her political values, socialism, feminism, the ecological, significantly receding. It accounts, at least in part, for what we talked about yesterday as her retention and escalation of her critique of neoliberal capitalism. So that's one strategy. But connected to it is the issue of political burnout. It's one thing to keep protesting a damaged world, the cost of neoliberal daily politics, but how to keep on keeping on with that protest, either as an activist or political theatre maker at the risk of burnout. During Waves of Activism, Hannah Proctor observes that a political commitment to revolutionary goals often comes at the expense of emotional well-being. Agitating for change takes its psychological toll, impacting not only the energies to keep up the struggles, but also on interpersonal relations within movements themselves. Hence, affective caregiving is essential to social movement, she argues, when fighting against oppressive and exploitative social conditions, even when victory seems remote. But attention also needs to be paid to emotional well-being in between waves of activism, to what Proctor, citing Lisa Baritza, identifies, and I'm quoting here, as a different time. She calls it the slowness of chronic time rather than the time of rupture. The slowness of chronic time rather than the time of rupture. The durational drag of staying alongside others rather than the time of transgression. To exemplify, illustrate this point, recollect my brief description of Churchill's Escaped Alone yesterday. The 4 older women sitting alongside each other, afternoon, in each other's company. Despite their individual anxieties, there is a feeling of collective resilience enmeshed in these spirited afternoon socials. It's not a consciousness-raising feminist collective, but neither is it an all-female gathering in which women talk over and fail to listen to each other, as we saw in Top Girls. It's an affirmative, mutually supportive group in which the women manage their respective anxieties and the cost of neoliberal politics as they occupy the durational drag of staying alongside others rather than the time of transgression. So taking time to care for each other in and beyond waves of feminist activism is the wisdom that Churchill's older generation of women pass on to those younger generations agitating for change and those social movements still to come. So now moving on to Hannah Proctor's notion of anti-adaptive healing and its application to a feminist theatre context, the second observation I wanted to bring to the round table. For Proctor, anti-adaptive healing designates how, and I quote, the psychological toll of political struggle necessitates contending with the contradictory relationships between the transformative and the restorative, between revolution and healing, between rupture and repair. On the one hand, she deploys it to explore the contradictory endeavour of striving to heal psychic wounds in a wounded and wounding social reality without affirming its structures in the process. And on the other, she also considers the psychic damage that can be incurred by fighting to transform social reality so as to make it less psychically wounding. So, transposed to the context of Churchill's theatre, anti-adaptive healing is a way to think about how Churchill's dramatisations of a wounded and wounding social reality may wound us in their viewing, while also potentially eliciting anti-adaptive feelings towards the dystopic social reality she portrays and a healing sense that the world could be otherwise. So in brief, this is a theatre that potentially generates anti-adaptive, resistant feelings towards the dystopic, ecologically and socially damaged world created by capitalism, the perception of which may wound, but heals through the utopian impulse to desire differently. So a resistant anti-adaptive mode of spectatorship is one that Churchill repeatedly has sought to form. I've yet to consider the wider application of this anti-adaptive mode of spectatorship beyond Churchill to think how it might also apply to work by other feminist playwrights and practitioners. So something I'm still to think about. But in Churchill's case, an anti-adaptive mode of spectatorship is formed whether by means of the Brechtian feeling structures she formerly deployed that we looked at in Top Girls, or the elliptical, poetic shape-shifting that characterises her later work, or the Skriker, again as we looked at yesterday. Her dramatic formations of anti-adaptive affectively realised perceptions of a world that does not transform socially or ecologically are those which potentially give rise to the politicising something to be done feeling. And yet, to be wounded by the vision of a world hurt very badly, to borrow the words of her mythological Skriker, is no guarantee of an anti-adaptive desire to desire differently and to act for change. As Ford and Co. point out, although a negative emotional response to a problematic status quo may encourage citizens to take effective political action and reshape the political system that evoked the negative emotions in the first place, regulation strategies that people deploy to cope with the chronic stresses a political order generates might militate against them desiring and acting for change. Hence, Ford and Co. propose that, to quote, to effectively harness people's negative emotions, those engaged in social movements need people to not reduce those emotions and may even want to increase them. So again, transferred to a political theatre context, this is a reflection worth considering. Certainly a Churchillian mode of anti-adaptive spectatorship involves heightening the negative emotions generated by a problematical existing order, thereby optimizing the potential to rupture audiences' emotional attachments to those socio-political structures that cause utmost social and ecological damage. But if you heighten negative emotions, then you need in another way to also take care of those impacted. In the case of activists and social movements, where experiencing an intensification of negative emotions may impact a sense of well-being, Ford & Co. also counsel the need for ways to bolster well-being after an action has taken place. This also resonates with what Proctor advocates as the necessity to acknowledge and address the psychic damage that can be incurred by fighting to transform a social reality. And in theatre, there also has to be that counterbalance sense of healing or the reparative. An anti-adaptive mode of spectatorship is not only against the damaged world that is, but also for the hopeful possibility of an alternative, democratic, feminist future. When What If Only ends, it closes with the child future, who is one of the hopefuls. To the child future, Churchill assigns the last line of the play, and it is, "I'm going to happen." It's a reparative, hopeful note, but this is only one of the many possible futures. As the spirit of the lost alternative future makes clear, everything will depend on the living. In sum, as the ghost of equality and cake and no bad bits at all pleads, make me happen. The living must make me happen, please, please.
Thank you, Elaine. That was quite moving and also full of resonances. And because this is something about the feminist futures you've been thinking for such a long time, because 15 years ago when you came to JNU and you and Anuradha actually gave the keynote for ISTR, at that point there was this idea that, and yesterday one of you did mention it, that, okay, feminism has happened, we've achieved what we had to do, and we don't need to think about it anymore. And then the whole right-wing politics, what's happening to India, what's happening all over the world, sort of struck us. And Elaine, the way you go into theatre from activism, that there's still this imagination which can be reparative. And it's not only symptomatic, which is, we don't adapt and non-adaptive, the negative, but it's also a catalyst for something for the future. And should we then ask Malarika to respond to it? Because, Malarika, yesterday when we were talking about women being in politics for progressive politics, which today we see in a very different light again. And again, where the actresses and the theatre stands, but also your larger work on the revolutionary women who were almost invisibilized and forgotten, when we thought feminism has been achieved. What is the position now?
In a way, thank you for bringing me in at this point, because I've been thinking along these lines, because, memory, politics, emotion, and feminism have been really quite central to what I have been thinking, working on. But I would also kind of like to take over, draw from what Elaine has just spoken to us, first in terms of burnout, in terms of political and emotional. And they are intertwined. that, let's keep in mind, for the time being, at least in the back of our minds, that politics includes emotions. And emotion definitely has political edge. The way emotion kind of shapes not only the individual but the collective as well. So interpersonal relationships, intra-individual relationships, and the way a collective moves. So if we are trying to kind of take off from the idea of the burnout, so let's see how we can kind of take off from there. So, because, as I have been studying women in social movements, so social movement studies offers an interesting perspective in terms of peaks and plateaus in the lives of social movements. What actually also goes back to the ruptures and the drudgery of chronic time. So if we kind of relate it with that, so the peaks of the ruptures and the plateaus, the durational drudgery in a social movement. So if we accept that emotions or affective experiences articulate a structure of feelings, and I will be kind of thinking of Raymond Williams when I am thinking of structure of feelings. The cultural turn in theoretical considerations makes it possible to understand social movements as collective articulations of alternative or transformative structures of feelings, which crucially link emotions with action. So, a political or social mobilization involves collective emotions, and that in effect leads to action. So politics, emotion, action are then linked to each other in the way a collective moves. So the emotional dimensions of collective mobilizations are usually distributed in three interrelated arenas. So those who are inside the movement, the participants, they are opponents, the ones they are fighting against, and then there is the general public or the bystander. Each of these categories are linked in these peaks and plateaus of the way in which a social movement functions. So, collective acts such as singing or shouting slogans are translations of collective emotions into collective performances where the bonding between participants creates the emotional content of the particular event. So emotional ways of looking at a political mobilization is how the insiders articulate their feelings and actions, how collective identities are formed through collective performances and empathy, how belonging and solidarity are forged through shared memories. But these emotions, because let's remember, inside the opponent and the bystander, so these emotions range from loyalty, hope, and trust to anger, distrust, fear, shame, and contempt. So it kind of links to the negative emotions that are very much part of experiences that go into a social movement, the way you were talking about it, and there are heightened moments, and they drain one's emotions out. But hating the opponent and distrusting its maneuvers is as much part of being an activist as hope and loyalty and camaraderie with your own activist participants are. And both can be very draining in the way the interpersonal relations within the movement is shaped. And this is precisely where also, in some ways, the gender framing may happen, that in the kind of larger metonymic binary, we have often kind of divided reason versus emotion, where reason is masculinity and emotion is femininity. And rational political choice is a masculine aspect, whereas emotional response is a feminine way of responding. So now if we take that binary off and link politics and emotion through these modes of being within a social movement, then actually gendering of emotions and the feeling of burnout can also be thought from a different feminist point of view, perhaps. So one example which I wanted to give was the very recent R.G. Kaur Medical College movement, where in August 2024, a medical intern, young female medical intern, was raped and murdered, and that kind of went into a collective mobilization demanding justice, and created an incredible moment on 14th of August at night, on the eve of India celebrating its 78th Independence Day. From metropolitan centers to smaller towns to village hamlets, the night of 14th experienced an unprecedented outpourings of citizens on the streets, mostly led by women of different ages. Walking on the street at night became a political performance for women that night, a new language of protest and new articulations of feminist politics. The protest continued for weeks, even months, demanding, and we want justice kind of became a chant that resonated through the streets. Continued for 3 months, but then there is a kind of, after that peak, after that, kind of rapturous moment, there of course came the ebbing. And there is a kind of drawing out, bleeding out of the energy that went into the protest marches and all of that. There seems to be a sense of disenchantment, especially among the women's rights activists, and a post-mortem of the movement has already begun, with critical reflections on the limitations of the movement in terms of its failure to consider women workers' rights across classes and castes, because of course this is a middle-class urban woman raped and murdered at her workplace. So of course, the way the movement shaped the event itself and the emotional outpourings that went into that, our daughter, creating the victim as our daughter. So who is this we, whose daughter, and how that fractures it. And so women workers' rights across class and castes, as well as its metropolitan middle class bias, and more importantly, the bifurcation of the demands of the movement between focus on corruption in the government healthcare system versus the assertion of women's rights. As fatigue sets in, so do despair and a sense of defeat. Social media lamenting of declaring nothing is going to change has also almost come to the end of its circulation cycle. Exhausted protesters have either gone silent, trying to mend their injured hearts, or in some sporadic moments blamed each other for the failure. So what happens when we look at it from the feminist perspective? This is something, what I was kind of trying to set up in the beginning, that how do we look at burnout from a feminist angle? We can start thinking with Joan Scott on feminist melancholia. Melancholy, and this is a quote from her essay, Feminism's History. Melancholy rests on a fantasy of a home that never really was. Our idealization of the intensely political, woman-oriented moment of recent feminist history and our desire to preserve it has prevented us from appreciating the excitement and energy of critical activity. The point of looking to the past was to destabilize the present, to make the unthinkable thought. This is where the quote ends. So it needs to be pointed out that this internal critique, kind of thinking about burnout while, kind of paving through that hard road of feminism, kind of doing it simultaneously together, in spite of containing relevant practical questions, can be couched in a narrative of either mourning or maybe hopefulness. So if we go into the mourning for the loss of a dominant position that could have had a particular kind of future. So as you were ending with, that there are many futures possible. So which one is going to happen? Which one the living are going to make it happen depends on how the politics, emotion, and collective mobilizations are going to relate to each other. So it is imperative for activists in women's feminist movements and gender politics to treat such activities as part of the fundamental change in the social perception of gender discrimination, rather than getting it docketed as something accomplished or failed. Because I guess our experience of modern political revolutions since 18th century has taught us that politics cannot be so neatly labeled.
Thank you, Maularika. But before we go to Navneeta, just because, Elaine gave that very interesting sort of thing on affect and affective response. So what you're talking about, this politics of emotion and political and emotion, can they be interchangeable, this sort of affect of a response and, the way you are looking at emotion? That's one. And secondly, I was thinking, of the protest and what happens when the protest dies out. And we know that in JNU. And, the whole Jodie Dean sort of argument that when the crowd goes home, it's the political party which takes on, right? So the idea is that the crowd is not transformed into a political community. It's left for a party organization to do it. And of course, she's talking about the Communist Party. Now, is there a feminist alternative to that? What would a feminist do, when we are talking about party?
Do you want me to?
Or, if Elaine wants to talk about emotion and affect and melancholia, because that really takes it into, I think, a bit of an abstraction.
Right. So the first, yes, the way I have been kind of thinking about emotion and affect, that of course there is a huge critical literature on the way affect and emotion can be differentiated, whether affect is a more bodily response, kind of physical response, and whether emotion is the more crafted, filtered, distilled through experience, that the way a response emerges. But I would like to kind of put them together in the sense that, as we have been thinking about, public gestures of protest, the typical Black Lives Matter protest of, hands up kind of gesture, which is both a bodily affective form, but also is distilled through a long history and memory, which shapes an emotion towards racism, and that goes into making that bodily gesture and an affective response meaningful in certain ways. So I would kind of like to place that. And the second question about when the crowd goes home and the political party takes over, we would really, I guess, have liked to have a party which would. But the feminist response would be, see, when the crowd goes home, the homes change. Homes don't remain the same anymore. And especially then, probably the kind of changed, transformed homes would produce a very different kind of politics which will take over the public sphere in the next time of rupture. So that is probably a feminist hope. I can.
Connects to Elaine's thing about, the day-to-day life, subjectivity.
And I, I do respect Jodie Dean's work a lot, but I part company as well. Not just on the party issue, but because she dismisses the arts. She calls the arts a kind of false kind of activism, that somehow if you're involved in the arts, you're not really doing politics. I'm sorry, I can't agree with that. Because I think the arts is, once we biased towards theatre in my own case, is one possibility of keeping energies going in the times that are kind of lower. Okay, the protests might go away, but there are still possibilities of artistic making that can keep the hope alive in the way that Churchill does. To recover from a kind of time of rupture and then to have this kind of drag of time. I think, and that's why I come back to the hard road to renewal. For those of us with the feminist skins, I said we shouldn't lose. We can shed them, we can change them. If we don't have art in the world as part of our political landscape, my goodness, wouldn't it be so much poorer? So I do think, to add to complement what you're saying, Malarika, is to value the arts in that way, which Jodie Dean doesn't. And that's why I would come back to Chantal Mouffe instead, because her argument that we need the Gramscian many fronts is also, for me, absolutely critical, because maybe the energies of one front die down, but there are other fronts. If you can always keep making those connections, there's a way to re-energize another front. Strengths and weaknesses in any particular moment. So we have to have those connections. There have to be a kind of possibility of mass hookup somewhere down the line. Otherwise, we do keep travelling that hard road. Okay?
With that, we come to Navneeta. And, because this has been an interdisciplinary dialogue. Your presentation was about intersectionalities, which is so important in feminist practices. So do you want to respond to further from you?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Elaine and Malarika. So much to, think over, and from the whole course, but also from today. But I was really thinking, like, today's presentation, when you were talking about the stickiness of certain images and certain texts, right? So, this is something we've talked about when talking about this roundtable. But so somewhere, if you think about disciplinary backgrounds, like I'm someone who's trained in literary studies, like my undergrad and master's and MPhil, and my PhD was literature and gender studies. And then, the kind of work I do, I bring together primarily different kinds of cultural forms, from literature to cinema to visual art more recently. But I've never worked directly on theatre in that sense, right? But then many of the questions that have, been so central to the debates that we are talking about now, about what is the potential or power of political stagings, right? Like that, I think, becomes it cuts across, because it also depends on how you think of cultural forms. So if you are thinking of cultural forms itself as political, politically charged, and, that political activism also has a creative energy to it, then these are not different zones, right? So I think then when you think of it, many of these questions about how do bodies appear and what impressions do they produce, right? Which is, I think, a central question of theatre studies too, right? What does it mean to appear before a public, and what kind of collectives do they produce, right? What is the capacity to move, right? Say a woman comes on to stage, what does that presence do, right? Which I think has been a long question, especially in the Indian context with the figure of the actress, but also the figure of the dancer, more recent times, a bar dancer, many kinds of these bodies that are programmed in different ways, right? Like seen to be sexual, or sometimes seen to be, that they can appear only in a certain way. So if they appear in another way, right? Like, so there's so many, so many ways in which questions around feminist theater studies, I think, cuts across. There's so much possibilities of dialogue. And the other connection one can see is also formally how multiple mediums are really drawing on each other. So all through this course, I was also thinking about this recent film, like this Malayalam film, Artam, which translates as Play, which is a 2023 film. And it's an interesting film because when you were talking about Emilia as a Me Too play, there's a lot of texts that have emerged in the last 10 years, and more recently, like after the 2012 Delhi gang rape, but more recently after Me Too also, like within India, globally, but within India too, which are directly taking on this question of sexual violence, but also bringing, sort of reflecting on a certain kind of impossibility of moving on. Right, like that. What do we do with this problem of violence? Like, what kind of modalities do we have to then speak about it, or voice it, or engage with it, right? And it's interesting that Artam actually uses, it's a cinematic form, like it's a film, but it really uses the space of theater and practices of theatricality to then talk about this problem of sexual violence, and this particular, because it's basically a play of where it's a troupe of 12 to 13 people, where like it's overwhelmingly men. So there's only one woman who's part of the troupe, and she has this one episode of sexual assault in the night when she's sleeping, and then the next day morning when she confronts them, it like till then you felt it was a very comfortable space, and she's this actress who's very modern, who's very comfortable in that space, physically very comfortable with many of the men, and there's a way in which she is at home there seemingly, right? But the moment that she sort of brings in this kind of unwanted touch, suddenly that consensus breaks, right? And there's this whole way in which it moves to other modes. It reminds you of a court trial. The questions of evidence are raised, like like camera footage is brought in, photographs are asked for, and suddenly all these sort of what we thought were spaces of trust, right, becomes quickly a space of betrayal, right? And you suddenly brought home to the fact that these experiences are somehow not transferable. Like, it's not as if she's not speaking, but her speech is not reaching, right? Like, so that, and the interesting thing is that the film actually uses that form of staging, like, because it's continually conversations, and often conversations between the men about, do you think it really happened? Can we trust her? What will we lose if we take her on seriously? No, that could not have been it. And retellings, they're telling each other, then everybody is mistrusting everybody else. And that then, becomes a strategy, right? In which the cinematic is then talking about, the difficulties of speech, right? And of redressal also, I think, because, which is it's a problematic, that you also brought up, I think, in one of the lectures, right? Like this whole question of, okay, we are in damaged worlds, what adequate tools do we have or what can we invent to sort of address this damage, right? Both, I really found that discussion you had of Carol Churchill's play, Skriker, where you brought in those questions of human and ecological damage, and the way in which you bring in a kind of non-human figure, right? And speech also, which is not realistic, right? Like broken, fragmentary language forms, but also the body itself, right? I think that there you really get to some of the questions about the affective dimensions, which is not which cannot be quickly folded into linguistic categories, right? Because the emotional, often we are using cultural, linguistic significations to hold, right? But the potentiality of the affective, I think, is that one doesn't quite know what to do with it sometimes, right? Like that it could potentially lead to one kind of future, but it could potentially lead to a very dark one too, right? Like one doesn't, there is that in every slice of history, there could be many of these, what you say, forces or energies, right? And how do we feel it on the body, right? So I think the theatrical in some ways, for me, like, why theater and why feminist theater? I think it's also because of many of these things, right? Like the immediacy of it, the collectives it can produce, and even like something like a protest on a street, right, does sometimes have that quality, right? Like that suddenly it can resonate, or from one person it interlinks to the other bodies on the field. So this capacity, I think, to move and to be moved, right? Like that is the key element of the theatrical, which sort of translates to many other fields of the political, right? And therefore, it becomes very significant, I think, for multiple fields, and especially for a field like ours, right? Like when you think about the where we are in women's studies today, right? Like because the point you were making about thinking about what is the centrality of art forms, right? Like why is the aesthetic significant? I think that's a question that women's studies today has to take on, right? Like because increasingly, I mean, and that way I'm happy that we as a women's studies department could actually sort of host this series of talks, because there is I mean, today morning also we were having some of these discussions because Malarika has this wonderful paper on the history of women's studies as a discipline in India, and one thing that you see is that there are certain directions that disciplines move towards, right? Like, so because of many reasons, like the histories of state formation, the post-colonial, the developmental model, there is a certain way in which in disciplines like women's studies, there seems to be a commitment to certain modalities of research, right? Where increasingly the question of mediation is not what is getting center stage, but what is getting center stage is a question of reform, of development, of intervention. Some kind of, okay, we can make real change, right? And then often the aesthetics is pushed aside, right? Like as something not so important, right? Like, okay, the art making is happening in the side, but that's not the real, core of the discipline, right? And that leads, I think, to a crisis, right? Like, because actually when you think of it, what is not mediated, right? Like, so any practice, right? Like any practice of change also is happening in using the fabric of language, the fabric of signification, right? Like, so there is a whole set of cultural practices that is central to everyday living itself, right? So unless we take on that question of what is mediation or what do forms do, right? Like disciplines like ours, I think, are really, these are very important questions for us, right? Like, because, say, even something simple as how do women dress? Right? Like that's, is that a political question? Is that an aesthetic question? It is a question of staging also, right? Like, okay, how do you decide you're going for an interview, or you're going for somebody's wedding, or, you're taking a class, right? Like there are codes, right? And sometimes you go with the codes, sometimes you break the codes, but we do know, right? Like, and that the perception, like the video you were saying about how race and, in your presentation also, right, who's seen as the good woman or the respectable woman, or whose voice will be seen as legitimate, right? A lot depends on appearances, right? How are we seen, and how do we sort of assemble the self, right? Like, and that question of fashioning is speaking to the field of theater too, right? So in that sense, I feel that many of the questions we have raised through this, few days, really like, like one of the things that I think you said in the lecture today about feminism can change the way we see the world, like that is an interesting, proposition, right? Like that, it is also a question of can we, like the manifesto we were looking at yesterday, right? Like that, the kind of, in drama, there's a hope of reaching people, developing an awareness which will determine how we act, right? So that kind of potential that theatre has, that it can, one doesn't quite know what it will do, but it could do, right? Like that I think is very, very significant with aesthetic forms, that it is where poetry and the pamphlet are coming together. Both have this desire to change, right? Like there is some kind of effect it wants to produce. One cannot predetermine that effect, but it does have that possibility. And that, I think, is the very powerful potential of feminist theatre and activism, right? And in the synergies between the two, which really came across wonderfully in these 5 days. So, yeah, we could take it from there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just sort of thinking of, something which Chanel Reinhold has sort of, because you're talking about film. Yesterday, Malarika showed Ray's film, but she also showed Amir Khan's, mainstream popular culture television protests in a way because it's in the street. And then Elaine's thinks about this, very sort of feminist theater, which again, in a book which we've collaborated, it's on Maya Rao, how those radical performances happen at the center to bring up the issues. But, one thing which never came up because it was 5 days, and really, Elaine, we would like you to talk a little bit about it, because Elaine has this, book which she wrote with her collaborator Geraldine Harris called The Good Night Out for the Girls. And it's been very impactful, at least for us in theatre and performance studies. And it looks at, when feminists went back to looking at musicals, at, women-oriented popular theatre, at stand-up comedies, which is so much part also of a neoliberal culture, but, women in those stand-up comedies. Is this also the mainstream where we come in from certain focus point into a larger field? Elaine, you need to do one more class on Good Night Out.
Oh, no. So you want me to say a bit about that?
Yes. And today, because you wrote Revisiting Feminism, in that way, would you revisit popular culture?
Okay, well, so Good Night Out for the Girls, if I just talk about, I'll go back to what I was doing in the talk, motivation, rationale, context. Okay, so the motivation came from, one of them was with my feminist sister, Geraldine Harris, Jerry. We felt a bit tired of the question of feminism also always being in the future, like thinking in terms of what feminism should we have, always the goal, somehow it's always out there somewhere. So we decided we wanted to shift the question to what feminism have we got? Instead of a future one, but let's put it in the present tense. The context was because it was a time in that first decade when the UK had this outcrop of shows that were roughly described as women-friendly shows. And you could find the male critics that I'm so fond of, remember, being very detrimental about them. It's like, oh, this sentimental trash and women are going to, there's nothing, it's all low culture. They're very, very, very negative. And emotions came into it. It's like, oh, these, they're going for the feminine emotional show, the sentimental. So they were really negative. And then you got the argument, the more scholarly argument, well, women are being duped by going to these shows because they're making, big bucks for capitalism. But we went with a different set because we were interested in what feminism have we got. And we were more interested in what women were doing with these shows. Because what you uncover is that women were not just seeing the shows, they were making events out of them. So yes, you get the hen parties, yes, you get the big groups of women going out together, but often in a kind of like their familial and friendship groups. And they will, I've been to some very riotous performances of Mamma Mia. They take over. There was one of our exceptional female critic, Lynn Gardner, who's retired now, once wrote a review of one of these shows saying, the show isn't what's happening on stage. The show is what's happening in the audience among the women there. So I kind of think, yes, the ticket prices can be high for those kind of shows, but women are using them for their own ends, their own social networks, their own entertainment. They're turning it into event. Now, to analyse that kind of work, we did have to find different strategies. And that's why, when I said about the performance analysis of starting with like those impactful moments, we had to do it with those kind of shows because you can't possibly start by, you haven't got a kind of text to analyse in the, you don't have a text like Top Girls that you can read alongside, so you are going for those highly affective moments. To practice a performance analysis. And to do that, it was through that we were then analysing a notion, not of feminism as such, but popular feminisms created through those shows. And you had to look at that interaction between the stage and the audience and the constitutive of popular feminism. And we didn't want to, we changed the place of looking. We've talked about where to look a lot this week. So I guess we were following the Jill Dolan trail there about let's change where we look and let's see what feminism we have got through that. And I think alongside of that, it feeds into what I've argued elsewhere is we shouldn't be dismissive. We want all those feminisms wherever they are. Because again, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken clock, watch, wheel, coming back to the same point. But if we can't if we can't move across the whole spectrum and make the connections, we can't split the hairs anymore. We have differences, yes, and those differences must be respected, but not at the expense of losing the synergies. Otherwise, we just keep going backwards. Yeah. Okay, I hope that gives you a little insight.
Open it up for the students because we may not have a Carol Churchill, but we do have a lot of popular culture. So would anybody like to respond and take up?
Just to sort of look at affect, I'm this is from a very sort of space of self-interest, but I've also seen that affect, especially after Sara Ahmed flagged it in terms of hate speech and all after 9/11, and how sort of that whole hatred and all came into political discourse, and then emotions sort of came in, and they lost that gendered thing that emotions are sort of domestic and logic is what is public in politics. Sort of she flagged that moment and she goes into it. And so this whole idea of affect and of feminist attachments. Now, I'm just sort of, I want your opinion on something like this, all of you, because it does talk about modality and aesthetic, it does talk about affect. And so there is this show called a sketch comedy that is on sort of responding to the misogyny of movies. There are these two girls who sort of do that online, and they sort of use this affect of rage to show that it is not about us feeling afraid, it's about you who need, like, so that affect of rage, sort of disgust, which then makes patriarchy accountable, which makes the makers and celebrators of such movies accountable. Now, in one moment, just before the lockdown, sadly, this online show had this, it culminated into this gathering of these two people because of this show, which Netflix otherwise sort of sponsors on YouTube, so that they can promote these movies, ironically, which they are sort of critiquing for their misogyny, a college sort of called them, a women's college called them for a gathering. And that was sort of a big moment in terms of history of popular feminist performances, because, or popular feminism's performances, because here is this online show which suddenly the same pair is being called, and there is this moment that happens, and there was such a momentum that just after that the lockdown was announced, so they went into also having non-binary sort of people on the show. So not only two women, but say one cis and one maybe bisexual or gay. So sort of that came in terms of presentation. So from a very popular feminist moment or a sort of enterprise of Netflix, it then stepped into a public space, and as with their identities as feminist performers or popular feminist performers intact. Now in such cases where the affect comes from something like this, which is not supposed to be as political or as serious, and then to step into this public space, and then take on the role that if we have been now recognized as such, apart from Netflix, into this college space, and then we will go into further representation, presentation, how does one sort of read those possibilities in, like you said, what we have now for feminism?
And who will take it? You? Yeah, and Navneeta, because your work also has to do with gender quite a bit, and that's something which, many people address.
No, I mean, I don't know about this particular event, but it's an interesting question about these linkages that we are seeing, right? Like, I mean, I think even around a lot of these recent protests, SEA, NRC, and Shaheen Bagh, there's also, like like your work also shows, people who are using the form of, say, stand-up comedy is becoming such a popular form, right? Like, and it's interesting to think why, like, and this kind of dark humor, right? Like as a sort of weapon or a tool to respond to despondence, but also the possibility of imagining, laughing together. What does that mean, right? Like, and one is laughing at oneself also, but also the situation we are all part of, right? Like, so I think there is an interesting question about laughter and its potential that is coming up, I think, in many global contexts, but in India, definitely. And also, when you think about different forms of political organizing, like you were mentioning, like if you look at my book, like, the book work I've done on queer politics in Kerala, there the argument I'm making is that, if you think about what forms activism, queer organizing, and queer lives and articulations take in regional imaginations and contexts, there is a way in which the popular and what is seen as more high art, or those distinctions really don't hold, right? Like, so say somebody like the last chapter of the book, which I really look at questions around queer lives haunting, how the past, and failures, like, say, the murder of a transgender activist is what is the center of that chapter. But the way that gets memorialized by this artist, Arya Krishnan Ramakrishnan, is through a turn to the popular. So everything from B-grade cinema to kind of, cult songs from Malayalam sort of enter into these practices of memorializing, right? Like, and so this whole and in many of these, through my research also, I could really see that even when you think about the figure of the sex worker, right? Like, I mean, that's the other figure that I look at. So one of the ways in which that figure becomes visible is through, like, say, progressive writings or realism, right? But the other way in which it's very visible accessible is through popular, especially B-grade cinema in the Kerala context, right? And these are not separate zones, right? And it's interesting that, say activist writings or, performance forms or even visual, performance art in that sense will draw on both these energies. So they are not actually keeping it separate. Like, I think it's also what do you cobble together to do politics in the present, right? And they are actually tapping into this long history of how, forms that have been frowned upon, right? Like, say, the recent book by Darshana Sridhar, like Rated A, where she's looking at the history of soft porn cinema in Malayalam, where she's again tracking figures like, say, Madhaka Rani, like this seductress, which has been, one of these, again, overtly sexualized figures. But she's actually using that figure to then say that it's also a figure that anchors a lot of desires that cannot be contained within the heterosexual reproductive family, right? Like, so it becomes both, an objectified figure, but also a figure that cannot be contained, right? So there is both things happening. It could be a very kind of masculine fantasy, but the same, within that same figuration, you also see a certain, excess, pushing against, right? And then when you track the lives of these actresses themselves, that, like, say, Lottie Hoyt does with Bangladeshi cinema, that then yields a lot, right? Like, because they are themselves acting figures who have been constantly mediating these different worlds, right? And even in the Indian context, it's interesting that even some of these iconic new wave actresses, like, say, Smita Patel, or, somebody so well known, has also negotiated. So on one hand, she was this face of, new wave cinema, the militant Mirch Masala woman, but she's also done, dances in the, in the rain, dances with Amitabh Bachchan. And
she also performed Silk Smita, right, in that film?
No, that's not, no, Silk Smita, Vidya Balan perform. But again, the Silk Smita figure is also interesting, how she comes back, right? Like, so I think for sexuality discourses in the Indian context, these histories of representation and these spheres of the popular, which was often seen as, sort of outrightly misogynist, has been recovered in very different ways by contemporary research, but also by contemporary activist practices that I think are also important to note, like that they do come back, people draw on it to also say that, it's never been a straight world. I mean, there's always been excesses, and the popular becomes one space to locate some of those energies, right? So that may be, for the digital to the live performances, how these longer histories also might be interesting to think about, right? Like, yeah. Okay.
Should we take more questions? Because
Can I just add one?
Yeah.
I'll do it as fast as I can. I just wanted. It's hard to comment without having seen it, but I just want to make a very quick point about which was always crucial for me, making the distinction between laughing at or laughing with, because so much. I think back to masterpieces, women at the butt of the jokes, but it's about when the comedy work. From a feminist perspective, which we've been looking at all week, it's got to be about the kind of creating laughter with women, not at, is the crucial thing. My brain's going because there was a connection to that as well. It's late in the afternoon. I mean, apart from, I was going to say that if it hadn't been for COVID, Jerry, though, we'd both retired around COVID time because of the pandemic. We were planning to make a, what would you say, stand-up duo that narrated in a comic way the history of teaching feminism and theatre as a way to reach, not do it as a formal lecture, but actually we had it in mind as a theatrical thing, which would have been fun to do. Right, I've remembered the thing I couldn't remember my senior moment, which is if I were doing a kind of analysis of like a deep analysis of feminism in its what's called in the UK fourth wave in that second decade. Though I'm a bit hesitant myself about fourth wave because I don't think in the UK we were very clear what the third wave was. But you would have to take account of the stand-up and the popular, because that, in the way that I went back to the Miss World and the street protest, if you were doing the same job of work for that period, you would really want to look at stand-up, because that's where the younger generation came in. And I think it's an accessible form, it's a cheaper way, not saying it's cheap, but economically, but to get in there and to mobilise alongside activism. Yes, apologies for the senior moment.
Any more questions? Damalika, you have a question. Who said yes?
Thank you. Okay, so my question actually is about this idea of affect. Of course, affect, as we saw in one of the slides, is something that sticks, that remains, that leaves its mark. But unfortunately, as I see it today, at least in contemporary India, people are living in an age of amnesia. They don't like to remember much and for long enough. Despite, however, whatever the poignance of any incident or event or whatever they see on screen, on stage, or hear about, they are very, somehow they can very readily forget it. And so firstly, in India especially, it has been a long time since we have had any full-on movement in theatre itself, in cinema itself, wherein directors themselves or producers themselves have, tried to band together, come along and, try to protest the ways in which the cinema is being produced today. Because especially if I go back to 80s, there was one movie by Govind Nirali, This Party, and there is of course very significant claims being made about the social commitment of any art form, just not the theatre. But I think that idea of art having to be necessarily, obligatorily, to an extent, being socially committed, or art actually not being art enough if it is not socially or politically committed or motivated. I think we have lost that, and now it's just consumptory, it's just consumption, it's just voluminous hogging over something that you can numb your brains with and go to sleep so that you don't have to think about things anymore. And so can I keep hoping is what I is what I want to ask in such a state, because of course you watch reels for an hour and don't remember any of it after 5 minutes. So in that sense, affect as a phenomenon, or as a possibility of something that sticks, to what intensity do you have to increase or raise the volume up so that this sticks, because it doesn't seem to be sticking anymore.
One is, I would like to first, take your first question about that people don't remember things. Again, I will go back to the idea of the politics of memory. The interesting part is that the way memory and forgetting are mobilized. Certain memories are mobilized at certain points of time, and the new media actually has enhanced it exponentially, how to mobilize certain kinds of memories for certain mobilizations to happen towards a certain goal, while emphasizing other kinds of forgetting. See, I would just like to, right now the popular film about a kind of 15th century, I guess, 17th century, during Aurangzeb's time, basically. So one particular Marathi historical character, and it's a popular film about his valor and his sacrifice. The way the popular reaction is almost kind of going through a template, that why haven't we told about this brilliant Marathi warrior in our school books. It's a template. Everybody who is writing about how moved that person is by that film is using that narrative, right? So see, there is a particular manner in which a particular memory is mobilized. And the forgetting also happens in the same way, the way that functioning happens. So let's not be, kind of very sure and be sad about the fact that people forget. No, they don't forget certain things. And that is precisely what they remember, how they remember, and what they forget when they forget. Those are the questions we need to keep asking ourselves. And the film question is actually not my area. I would definitely like Elaine
Okay, no. I mean, film. Yeah, no, film, like is a cost-intensive business, right? Like, so it is difficult to think about collective, but there are attempts. Like, say, I don't know if you've seen like Ektara Collective's films. They are one of the groups who are trying to actually make a smaller budget films collectively with people in the area, and they've the films do circulate. So it's an interesting question, like what different I can't really think of any media form right now which is outside of structures of capital, right? Like even something like when you say it's crowdsourced or collective filmmaking, still there is a lot of questions of power involved, and so there, it's not like Malarika is saying there's no pure space. One would have to think about within given structures what is possible, right? Like, and I think I mean, whether to hope or not to hope is always a question. Like, we're always between the two, I think, like somewhere, right? Like, but it's true. I think so. Last question.
Because there was a thing about it, just 1 second, about, neoliberalism and high capitalism. It will also, this whole idea of, alienation, which was the old Marxist theory of alienation. And, they said that high capitalism, there will be alienation, but with the idea that it also has to be overcome. Otherwise, where is the struggle? Where is the movement? Where is the resistance, right? And that's why I think we brought in the question of the popular, because, we know what is happening in name of the popular. So the old ideas of the, feminists, left, the idea of the people, idea of bringing people together is very different from the way the right wing builds consensus, right? So I think we do make a distinction with, where we are. We want to create stratification of publics. We create counter publics. I think that's where we are hopeful.
So I had a question on the same lines as what they mentioned, but just the fact that I had some online violence committed against me last year. Like I was witch hunted online, and for quite a few months, there were a lot of things happening, like bodily, and I had dreams and a lot of other things. And I was thinking about affect and how I had people from the left like tell me that, this is not real. Whatever happened to you, it was in relation to an offline event. And I had many people tell me that try to forget it faster because it's not like somebody harmed you. But there were sort of visible bodily, responses that I could feel. But this sense of what is a valid affect and the fact that how real or how tangible is this violence happening online. So there's one thought that says that people forget really fast, but this idea also that you should forget faster because it is not as real or it is not as, tangible. So the fact that for somebody who survives it or for somebody who is trying to make sense of it and navigate it, there is sort of no marker. There has to be some kind of a mainstream or, as you said, mainstream or mainstream idea of how to go about it, or what reaction or what time frame or what affect is valid. is 2 months valid? Because while it's happening offline, if somebody has hit you, okay, then it's valid. Or if there's blood, then it's valid. But if one has dreams or one has problems at work and life and very, very tangible sort of affects, it's not considered as tangible. So just wanted to know of your thoughts on that.
But it also comes a bit with some of the issues of free outgoing, doesn't it? That what can this online circulation, how it can affect and marginalize women.
I'm kind of just like shocked that were they acquaintances, friends that are saying that you've got to go for it, because it's a violation. There's no question. It doesn't matter that it's kind of in the, not in person, but in the cyber world. It's a violation of your identity, they've entered your kind of space, your feelings. It's a violation, and there's no question that it's like, deal with it, get over it faster.
But it's also because it's related to an event like a state event. So it was related to the government and the politics around the world. So it's it'll be helpful to you if you forget it faster and don't think about a tangible action. Because then it was around larger politics of the country right now. So it's not so much about you being a woman or a female person, but your femalehood in the larger politics that you're sort of, putting across on an online platform that's so accessible. And so the violence that's coming to you is also, you sort of asked for it. In that
But
sense.
you're fighting the state patriarchy, right?
Exactly that.
So solidarity with you.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of affect as well, I mean, they're all valid. All those emotional reactions are valid. No, they don't quite see why they wouldn't be. But it is, I think, I agree, if you're going to go up against the big bad state, whatever, then it's... But this would come back to Proctor's point about needing affective care, mutual caregiving. You need the comrades around you that will provide that and not ask you to kind of heal faster or whatever else, and accept that that was a violation. So I think that's where it comes back to having the supportive, affective support, caregiving, with other activists who share your fight. That's important, not to be alone. Alone would be the worst, I think.
And with that, we bring the discussion to an end. And Navneeta has a lot of thanks.
Yeah. For an event like this, which was over 5 days and then took a lot of planning, so there's a lot of thanks to give. But first of all, thanks a lot to Professor Aileen Aston for her, amazing and energizing lectures and all the interactive sessions we did together, which really, I think, brought us together as a group also. So thanks a lot, Aileen, for taking the time and, wonderfully putting all this together. It's really been great, thanks to Gyan program and by the Ministry of Higher Education, Government of India for, facilitating, and especially the Gyan coordinator, Professor Satyapratap Patnaik and his team, especially Saurabh Singh, who has been really supremely helpful. It's been a lot of students that have signed up, and there's a lot of behind the scenes work which they really helped us with. And thanks to Professor Vishnupriya Dutt, who's actually, this course plan was initiated by Malarika and Vishnupriya, and I came in a little later when you went off on leave, but we are grateful that you brought this idea and that you've been here all through the program for us. So thanks a lot, and thanks everyone from the Center for Women's Studies, both faculty and the staff, like Jiva Nindam is here, like Lata Singh, Arunima, Papuri, like all of us, I think, have been excited to host this. Lata is also here. Hi, Lata. So thanks everyone, and also our staff, Rajesh and Jay also, and our, chairperson and dean who was here the first day, Professor Kaushal Kumar Sharma, who's also helped facilitate this program. I would also like to thank CSRD from SSS, who gave us this venue, which is, as you know, in JNU, it's always a challenge finding a good venue. So thanks to them for that. And also the Center for Northeast Studies, they gave us the mics, which is, without that, this would not have happened. So yeah, big thanks to them, yeah. And there's this wonderful team of people who helped us with the technology and live streaming from Spotlight, a company, Mobin Joshi and Anish, who's here. Thanks a lot. They've stayed every day till 6:30, 7, helping us, photographing. They've done much more than I think they need to do. So thanks a lot. Because, mics and all that, so central to making an event like this successful. So great to have them here. And finally, big thanks to our 3 volunteers who've been such amazing presence. Komita Danda from School of Arts and Aesthetics, you all know her. She's really helped us organize things and, been such a wonderful presence. Neeraj Kumar Bharat and Leona Sissa, both from the Center for Women's Studies. Leona just joined and we pulled her in, and Neeraj has been here for 2 years. So wonderfully, they've really assisted and made this happen. We could not have pulled this off without their support. And also Indu Kumari from CWS, she's been sending us instructions online, I think, but she also designed the poster. So thanks, and thanks all of you. An event like this cannot happen without a community of participants. So online and offline, we've had a wonderful group of people. So we are very happy that we got this group, and some of you have, been so regular and participated so much. So thanks a lot, and thanks. I don't know if I have to say thanks to you, Malarika, but it was great like that. We managed to do this. So yeah, thanks. Hopefully we'll do more. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.